legends. Over the course of history, a lot of Marvel games have been made, and we are going to look at each and every one of them. So strap yourselves in, because this is every Marvel game ever. Coming in first, we have Spider-Man, and what a way to start. And of course, you've got to start with Marvel's most premier flagship hero, but boy, are these humble beginnings. Don't laugh, kids, but this is what your grandparents used to play with, and your parents, which would probably include my age demographic. Hey, I'm dating myself, but look at this game. Look at these blocky graphics. I am this old. But look, in the early 80s, this was groundbreaking. Now we have a series of text-based adventure games. The first one featuring the Incredible Hulk. These always remind me of the games that Tom Hanks's character used to play in Big while he was wishing to be a grown-up. It's literally just text on the screen with a few blocky pixelated pictures. But first of all, we had the Incredible Hulk. Then there was a sequel starring Spider-Man, and following that, there was one featuring the Human Torch and the Thing. There was gonna be a follow-up featuring the X-Men, though the company eventually went out of business, so I guess the games didn't sell well enough. And hey, things are looking more modern already. We have Howard the Duck, based off of the much maligned, and rightly so, Howard the Duck movie. In this game, you've got to go around and rescue your friends. I don't know, maybe they're on the way to the theatre to watch the film and you've got to stop them. Folks, I present to you Captain America in the Doom Tube of Dr. Megaloman. Now, I don't even know how this plays, but with a title like that, you've got to give the creators some kudos. In the game, Dr. Megaloman is aiming to launch rockets containing a deadly virus. The CIA discover his secret base below the Mojave Desert called the Doom Tube. Captain America is then sent in to stop the rockets from being launched and save the world. This game was not received well at all. Critics saying that it had bad graphics, disappointing sound, and really failed to live up to its license. But hey, we've all got to start somewhere. Fortunately, you can't keep a good Avenger down, and Captain America had a second go-round of things, this time teaming up with Spider-Man in Doctor Doom's Revenge. Now in this game, after each confrontation, you swap between Spider-Man and Captain America, and unfortunately the game didn't get great reviews, with critics mainly saying that it was kind of slow and unresponsive. But one thing I do notice when you look at it is that finally we're starting to get games where the heroes look like the heroes in the comics, and we're actually getting things that resemble the superheroes that we know and love. Now we have Uncanny X-Men on the NES, and even though this looks like it might have had some potential, it's actually one of the worst reviewed games on this list. So, Uncanny X-Men features a real classic X-Men team from the 80s of Wolverine, Cyclops, Storm, Colossus, Nightcrawler, and Iceman, and they battle across these different levels, facing such bosses as Boomerang, Sabretooth, Juggernaut, the White Queen, and finally Magneto. It didn't take long for the X-Men to have another go of things though, as shortly after we got X-Men Madness in Murder World from Paragon Software. The game is a side-scrolling beat-em-up that has over 500 action and combat screens, as well as various puzzle-solving elements as well. So I can't tell you if it's much fun to play, but it definitely seems like you get a lot of bang for your buck. Time for the third entry in the trifecta of X-Men games. It's X-Men and the Fall of the Mutants. And with this game, we leave the 1980s and kick down the doors of the radical 90s. This game was actually quite interesting because it opens with a scene with the Watcher, which kind of explains that this is taking place in a what-if type alternate reality, which means all bets are off. Spider-Man on the Amiga sees the Wallcrawler out to rescue his girlfriend Mary Jane, who has been kidnapped by Mysterio. And this whole Mary Jane getting kidnapped thing, yeah, it's gonna happen a lot. Silver Surfer was an unlikely character to get the video game treatment so early on, and in this game you play the Silver Centurion, Guardian of the Spaceways, or whatever you call him, as he battles from left to right in kind of a bullet hell sort of scenario. It's really hard, apparently, as a lot of these original games were, because they were made to last, and this game apparently puts you through the ringer. Now we've got a gaming system that I thought was pure witchcraft when I first saw it in 1989. It's the Game Boy. And what better superhero to make their debut on here than Spider-Man? Spider-Man versus the Kingpin sees Spidey once again out to rescue Mary Jane, who's been kidnapped by his villains. And it's a fun assortment of villains that we get in this game. Loads of comic book characters, Sinister Six members and whatnot, all appearing in this. So it's still kind of a humble beginning as far as platforming and controls are concerned, but it's just great to see these characters brought to life on a games console. Now we've got a few Punisher games. First of all, a very Operation Wolf style game with the first Punisher, and this is very much your on-rails kind of shooter, and it's a perfect format to have the Punisher in. You gotta go from left to right, shooting the bad guys, not shooting the good guys, picking up health packs, and generally doing what Frank Castle would. The next Punisher game involved 3 different types of gameplay, with classic run and gun, driving, and even scuba diving. It got decent reviews as well, with reviewers enjoying the variety of gameplay and the kind of wish fulfillment of just picking up a gun and being a vigilante. And finally, we have Punisher Ultimate Payback on the Game Boy. Again, it's an Operation Wolf style on-rails shooter, which I'm told is very hard and features a random surprise cameo from Spider-Man at the start. But while being difficult, it did get relatively good reviews, and it did what it could do with the Game Boy's pretty limited hardware. Wolverine on the NES is a classic 2D side-scrolling platform beat-em-up, and believe me, you're going to be hearing that description a lot because that is the niche that most of these games fit into, at least the earlier ones. And this was a fair attempt to translate Wolverine to the console in his first solo outing, but it wasn't anything very groundbreaking. And a lot of reviewers said that the controls were a little bit finicky, and also the game was itself very hard. Long before folks were disappointed with an Avengers game in 2020, we had Captain America and the Avengers to come out to middling reviews. Originally an arcade game, was then released on the home consoles, and it's fun to see characters like Iron Man brought to life, but it was a pretty humble beginning. Sticking with the arcades and looking a lot more modern now, we have Spider-Man, the arcade game. And if you look at the sprites on here, you can see, oh, we're moving into the 90s. The sprites are getting bigger, more colorful, better animated. This is a classic Golden Axe style arcade beat 'em up and is so fondly remembered by, well, me. It's got a really random assortment of characters too, with Spider-Man, Hawkeye, Namor, and the Black Cat all available for you to choose. Amazing Spider-Man 2 on the Game Boy sees Spider-Man, would you believe it, having to rescue Mary Jane, who's been kidnapped by some of his nefarious foes. The Game Boy is incredibly limited, of course, with its graphics and abilities, but as a handheld product, it was decent. And for a kid in the early 90s, it was fun to get to play Spider-Man on the go. Spider-Man vs. the Sinister Six was based on the recent comic book that had come out featuring the Sinister Six reforming, and it was written and penciled by Eric Larson, who's famous for absolutely bonkers tales, and this was no exception. So it was quite fun to see a comic book story get translated to the video game genre so quickly, and this was the shape of things to come as we'd get more video games that mirrored what was going on in the comics. Spider-Man and the X-Men. Two great tastes that taste great together, like peanut butter and jelly. Unfortunately, this did not make for a good game. You've got the right elements and the right characters, but the technology wasn't there to make a guaranteed success. So unfortunately, the critics said that this game looked quite nice for what it was, but the controls were fiddly, the gameplay loops were frustrating, and ultimately it wasn't the experience you might have hoped for. Alright, no more messing around. It's time for one of the big ones. X-Men, the arcade game. Oh me, this thing dominated the arcades in the early 90s and sucked up so many quarters and 50p's, but you got your money's worth. Huge big sprites, great 4-player action. This is what 90s arcade gaming was all about, and it gave us the line, "X-Men, welcome to die." Spider-Man 3 Invasion of the Spider Slayers holds a special place in my heart because this was the first Spider-Man trade paperback story that I bought. So to see that story turned into a video game, that's pretty cool, even if it's just on the humble Game Boy. It's Spider-Man battling a whole bunch of robotic creations made by Spencer Smythe. Or is it Alistair Smythe? Alistair Smythe. Either way, the story's a good time, and I hope the game reflects that. Now, arcade games just keep going from strength to strength, now with the Punisher arcade game. Just look at this. Look at how mean the Punisher looks. This is what arcade gaming is all about, going from left to right and beating the ever-loving bejesus out of bad guys. You've got the Kingpin in here, you've got some fantastic rogues, so much fun. Now it's the 90s and it's an X-Men game, so you know what to expect. You've got all the classics. Wolverine, Rogue, Gambit, Cyclops, and of course it is, what? A 2D side-scrolling platforming beat-em-up. And according to an IGN list of not that long ago, one of the absolute hardest games out there. A real killer for the only hardcore gamers. And it didn't take long for a sequel to come out with X-Men 2 Clone Wars. And this game, like its predecessor, was met with kind of average sort of reviews, with people saying that it was very difficult and the controls were a little bit finicky. This is a running theme that we would get in the X-Men 2D side-scrolling platforming beat-em-ups. But still, it was a fine game. Lethal Foes of Spider-Man is a tough one to get a read on because it was only released in Japan. I can, however, say that it was based on a comic book series that was out at the same time under the same name, and more importantly, the box art features the artwork of Mark Bagley, which just looks absolutely mwah, chef's kiss. Incredible Hulk is a game I remember so well from the 90s. This is absolute peak Mega Drive, Sega Genesis, whatever you want to call it, Super Nintendo. This was the era of these games, and just the look of it screams mid-90s classic, and it was very well received by critics. With a good mixture of platforming and brawling, the Hulk was a big, imposing looking sprite. This game was well and truly a success for the Hulk. Wolverine Adamantium Rage left some gamers in rage. I'm sure that must have been used in the reviews at some point. This was your typical side-scrolling 2D platforming beat-em-up, but it did not have the best controls, it would seem. They were apparently quite frustrating and finicky, and it was a very difficult game because of that. Not because of clever gameplay loops, but just because it was very hard to control. So I think led to quite a bit of frustration. Oh my goodness, Spider-Man and Venom Maximum Carnage. This was the game of the 90s. With its red cartridge, it's so iconic. But it's not good. Unfortunately, if you compare it to real great beat-em-ups like Streets of Rage, this is quite a bare-bones, lazy effort, and it could have been so good, but it wasn't, so it was a frustrating experience. It was okay, but there were much, much better things out there at the time. Oh my goodness, talk about a game changer and a groundbreaker. X-Men Children of the Atom. Someone took Street Fighter 2 and was just like, what if we did this exact thing with X-Men characters? Oh my god! And this is as 90s as it comes. Pretty much the cast of the 90s cartoon show recreated in Street Fighter style. It is wonderful, it's nostalgic, it stands the test of time.
Round 2.
Now things get basic, but actually still very good with X-Men on the Game Gear. This is a typical 2D side-scroller. You start off playing with either Wolverine or Cyclops, and in each level you rescue another X-Man who you can then take control of. And this game got very good reviews for tight, fun gameplay and long, challenging levels. X-Men Mutant Apocalypse is one that I would absolutely call a hidden gem. It's a typical side-scrolling beat-em-up, but so much more emphasis is placed on a Street Fighter II style fighting mechanic. So it's not just running along and bopping folks in the face, but there's a real nuance to the battles that you have, and the big chunky sprites are mwah, chef's kiss. Spider-Man Separation Anxiety, the follow-up to Maximum Carnage, is such a lazy effort. It is just Maximum Carnage, a few new levels, basically, and balls hard. It's so hard, but it's just not that much fun to play. Again, you look at some of the classic 2D side-scrolling beat-em-ups, and it's like, this cannot hold a candle to those, but it's got Spidey, so there's something going for it. X-Men Games Master's Legacy on the Game Gear was a follow-up sequel to Spider-Man and the X-Men, and it generally met with pretty good reviews, saying that it wasn't groundbreaking, but it was definitely an improvement on its predecessor. Spider-Man the Animated Series did not meet with a very good critical reception. It was another in a long line of 2D side-scrolling Spider-Man beat-em-ups, and by this point that felt very, very by the numbers, and the critics said so, with the game being bright and colourful, which was a good thing, but it offered pretty much nothing new to the genre, and was a bit of an arguably lazy cash-in on the TV show. Avengers Galactic Storm is a really weird little oddity that seems to have been forgotten amidst the sands of time. It's a 2D style arcade game, so this is why I think it's kind of been forgotten from our collective consciousness. But it's got these kind of 3D, 2D Killer Instinct style graphics. Although even though it's an interesting presentation, it failed to make much of a splash in the arcades, with more people crowding around Street Fighter Alpha 2. Marvel Superheroes, on the other hand, is an absolute classic. Carrying on in the same vein as X-Men vs Street Fighter, the classic 2D beat-em-up style, this time supplemented with the more galactic-type characters, even Thanos himself making an appearance as the big bad. This is one that has stood the test of time. Keeping in the Infinity Saga, but going to the small screen this time, we have Marvel Superheroes War of the Gems. This is a typical 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up, but it was very well received by the critics, who say it was above the average fare that was coming out at the time. Now then, we've had X-Men Children of the Atom, we've had Marvel Superheroes, and some bright spark thought, what if we had the Marvel characters fighting the Street Fighter characters? Oh, a beautiful violet baby was born, and it was glorious. Huge big sprites, bright and colourful, and some deep cut characters. This is a stone cold classic. Now, who could forget Spider-Man Web of Fire for the 32X? Of course, the answer to that is everyone! Because it came out and was largely ignored by the critics, because by the time it came out for the 32X, Sega had already announced that they were no longer going to be supporting that little misplanned system. So the game just kind of fell by the wayside, and in fairness, no one really missed much. It was a very basic, by-the-numbers 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up. Spider-Man vs. the Sinister Six is a game that was only released on PC and has not had much coverage. So much so that I'm not gonna lie to you, I don't know anything about this game. There you go, cards on the table. All I could get was just one clip of it with Spider-Man fighting Mysterio, as you can see, and it looks kind of melancholy? I don't know what to say. I guess he fights the other members of the Sinister Six, but judge for yourselves. Maybe dig up a copy from somewhere and find out. X-Men Mojo World is yet another 2D X-Men side-scrolling beat-em-up platformer. So as Aerosmith would say, it's the same old story, same old song and dance, and the same old 4.5 out of 10 from most reviewers who say, it does what it says on the tin. It's like Ron Seal, you know? So you get what you expect, but what you expect is probably not that great. Slightly frustrating gameplay, fidgety sort of controls. It's a typical experience. Now we have Iron Man Exo Man-O-War in heavy metal. Exo Man-O-War, say it with me. Who? Yeah, he was a character from Valiant Comics, and Marvel in the mid-90s were kind of like teaming up with them to do various things. In the mid-90s, you've got to trust me, Marvel Comics were not doing well, and they were clutching at any straw they could get. And a partnership with Valiant was one of them. However, it did not create a very successful game, as critics said this was extremely meh. Incredible Hulk: The Pantheon Saga was made by Eidos, who of course were famous for making Tomb Raider, and much less famous for making this because it did not fare well with critics. They said it was boring and difficult to control and not very creative, and sadly it's another one of those games that's going to be much maligned. Speaking of much maligned, we have the Fantastic Four. This property outside the comics just cannot catch a break. This game was described by critics as being a mediocre to poor side-scrolling beat-em-up, and if the slipper fits. I mean, the graphics, we're improving so much over time with the graphics, but apparently the animation is very stunted and not looking good, and it's not a good time for the Fantastic Four. Alright, we're well overdue for a good game now, and we've got one with Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter. Capcom were ever so slowly just integrating these two brands. First of all, they were separate with comics and Street Fighter, then we got X-Men versus Street Fighter, now we're bringing in some of the other Marvel heroes, and with characters like Venom, with a symbiote all flowing around him. This was a real treat for comic book fans that just saw these characters come to life in the 2D beat-em-up. X-Men Ravages of Apocalypse is weird. It's a Quake mod, essentially. Everyone remember playing Quake in the mid-90s? I know I certainly do, and there were all sorts of mods that changed the way that it looked and felt, and this was essentially just an X-Men one, so it was Quake with an X-Men skin. But you went around killing evil, like, clones of the X-Men. It was odd, and that's what it is. It's an oddity. It was kind of fun to play, but then if you're gonna do that, just play Quake. Alright, I jumped the gun earlier. I wonder if you spotted it. Venom did not appear until now with Marvel Superheroes versus Capcom. There you go, I've got my continuity right. This is just an extension of Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter, but with more now. Now both universes are fully colliding, and it's big and vibrant and utterly bonkers and so much fun to play. X-Men Mutant Academy. This I absolutely remember buying from Blockbuster Video and playing on my PlayStation. It's another 2D one-on-one fighter, but it's a little more nuanced. Well, not nuanced than the Capcom games, but it's a little more mellow. You can kind of take your time with it, and it's not as frantic and hyper vibrant as the Capcom games, but it's a lot of fun. And it borrowed a lot of designs from the movie that had just come out, which kind of really dates it in sort of a fun way. And now this is the big one, Spider-Man 2000. The first properly 3D Spider-Man game was a love letter to the property. You had Stan Lee narrating it, you had comic book covers you could find, you had so many Marvel superheroes making cameos and appearances. It was a great story. Spider-Man 2000, it was the template that other games could follow, and it is just an absolute classic.
Spider-Man, help me!
Alright, it's time to bring things down a little bit, and what better way of doing that than with a movie licensed game? These things are always a little bit dubious. And unfortunately for Blade in particular, it came out like 2 years after the movie, so the bloom was already off the rose, and this game just did not hold up particularly well. X-Men Mutant Wars. Say it with me, 2D side-scrolling beat-em-up. It's exactly what you would expect, and the critics' responses were what you would expect. 50%, 2 out of 5 stars, not particularly exciting. But if excitement is what you want, then Marvel vs. Capcom 2 is where you're gonna find it. Just everything you would expect from the Marvel vs. Capcom games, and just more. So many more characters, so many more stages. You've got the tag team battles, you've got more obscure characters, you've got deep cuts, you've got Cable in there. Cable in a 2D fighting game. Get out of here. This is so much fun, and just, they found the concept, they found the formula, and it works. Wolverine's Rage on the Game Boy Color was, say it with me, a 2D side-scrolling platforming beat-em-up, and it got average to negative reviews. And this is hardly surprising, we've got kind of a pattern developing here. But hey, the games kept making money, so I can't fault developers for continuing to churn them out. And even a bad X-Men game is like pizza. It's bad, but it's still kind of good. Spider-Man 2, The Sinister Six, actually got pretty decent reviews, with critics saying that it was a fun, if not basic, 2D side-scrolling platforming beat-em-up. But at least it had bright, colourful graphics and the sense of fun that I guess people appreciated in their Game Boy Color games. Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro was the much anticipated sequel to the 2000 Spider-Man game, and unfortunately, it didn't receive the critical reception that its predecessor did. It wasn't a bad game, but folks generally tended to feel that it didn't bring enough new stuff to the table, and it was quite short, with a story that felt rather rushed and a villain who wasn't as exciting, so it was kind of a disappointing follow-up to what was an amazing original. X-Men Mutant Academy 2 was actually a sequel that improved upon the original and got great critical acclaim because of it. It wasn't an absolute critical darling, but people appreciated the fact that it took what the original did and then expanded it with a huge roster of characters, 3D background, and just a lot more polish and shine than the original had, making it a very worthy successor. Spider-Man Mysterio's Menace on the Game Boy Advance was one that got reasonably favourable reviews. It didn't reinvent the wheel and was nothing particularly special. However, the graphics were bright and colourful and the gameplay was fun enough, making it an inoffensive entry to Spider-Man's canon. X-Men Reign of Apocalypse is an interesting one in that it actually got pretty favourable reviews, with the biggest criticism being that people wanted more. The game was a bit too short and people said perhaps slightly too simplistic, but what was actually there at its core was a decent enough 2D fighter. Now this is a big one. Spider-Man the movie, the game. Now movie licenses are a dubious proposition at best, but this one had so much care, attention and spit and polish given to it that it really did do incredibly well. With fantastic voice acting and web swinging, the game was very high regarded. There were some drawbacks with the indoor levels and the dodgy camera, but on the whole, this game is much lauded by critics. X-Men Next Dimension completed the trilogy of 2D X-Men fighters, and it was decent, but by this point it was starting to show its age as they hadn't really iterated on the formula at all. There were more fighters, more backgrounds and characters and stages, but at this point it was time for the X-Men games to move on and, dare I say, evolve a little bit. Now we have Blade 2, and was this game an improvement on the original? Sadly, no. It was very basic, again, with reviewers saying that the controls were awkward, it was frustrating, difficult to handle, and rack up combos. The notion of a Blade game should be easy. You just run around with a big sword, fight vampires, and kill monsters, but they just can't seem to get it right. Now we have a rare solo outing for Iron Man. And it's a bit of a shame that the only real criticism that people tend to give this game is that it's too short. There's not enough there. It's a good looking game and it's fun and easy to jump into. And this was before Iron Man was the multimedia juggernaut that he is these days. So it's nice to see him get a good outing. It's just a shame that there could have been given more bang for your buck. Speaking of rare solo outings, we now have Daredevil, but of course at this time the character was riding high. Well, that's a little bit much. The character was riding in the middle from the success, nay, partial success of his movie coming out, and therefore, of course, you get a tie-in game. And this one was decent. 2D side-scrolling platform beat 'em up as you would expect, but as a solo Daredevil outing, I'd say they did him proud. Incredible Hulk on the Game Boy Advance did exactly what it needed to do. You run around, you smash things, and you fight monsters, and in that much, it's a good time. It wasn't any kind of blow-away success or an amazing darling with the critics, but it was a fun entry into the Hulk's pantheon of games, which at this point is still quite humble. Hulk was based on the 2003 movie, which is one of the most divisive and difficult to rate Marvel movies. This was when they really hadn't got a formula down. This was pre-MCU and it was a funny property, but the game was actually pretty decent, with some Metal Gear Solid style sneaking sections in there where you transform back into Bruce Banner and have to use your wits to get through the level. X2 Wolverine's Revenge, based of course off the film X-Men 2. This game was a typical kind of movie tie-in where it's not terrible, but they're really not doing anything to reinvent the wheel. Generally, critics said that it was an okay playthrough, but the stealth sections were a bit clunky, the controls weren't great, and it was all a bit bland. So really, there were better games doing better examples of what it was trying to do.
They're closing in, Logan.
Now we've got a really big one. It is Spider-Man 2, an amazing sequel to an amazing game of an amazing movie of an amazing sequel. This set the bar so high for what an open world Spider-Man game had to be. New York was beautifully realized, huge, and the city felt alive with so many side quests and things to do. It's arguably only recently been bettered by PS4 Spider-Man. X-Men Legends is a love letter to fans of comic books, the X-Men, and the property as a whole. For anyone who's been following these characters, we finally get a game that just embraces everything about them with a new kind of format as well. The top-down, three-quarter angle Diablo-style perspective. You run around with a whole team using different powers. It was such an innovation at the time. No time was wasted in building off of the success of X-Men Legends. We had X-Men Legends 2, Rise of Apocalypse. More of that action role-playing combination which works so well. They really hit upon something great with this game. It's not for everyone. I myself am not a big action role-playing kind of guy. A bit too button-mashy for me. At least I feel that way. Maybe I'm not smart enough to understand the systems, but enough people were, and they had a great time with this game. Okay, let's take things back down a little bit now with a movie tie-in. So you know that we have a mixed bag when it comes to these, and this is Fantastic Four, a film in itself which is not considered to be one of the masterpieces of comic book movies. I thought it was fun popcorn nonsense, but Fantastic Four can do better, and hopefully it will do very soon. But as for the game, it was extremely average, and critics said so. Not terrible, not a train wreck, but nothing to write home about. We weren't done with the Fantastic Four though, as now we have Fantastic Four Flame On, which is featured mainly around, as you can guess, the Human Torch on the Game Boy Advance. This is a bright, colourful, cartoony, fun-looking game. I really don't know much about it at all, but it seems like it was created just to be a light, fluffy, good time, and hopefully it was for those who played it. Ultimate Spider-Man. How can I remember renting this from Blockbuster so vividly when it was in fact 15 years ago? This was based off of the Ultimate Spider-Man comics and had a really fun cel-shaded look to it. It was a very, very pretty game. And in this, you got to play as either Spider-Man or Venom, both with different play styles, keeping things interesting. It was a well-remembered game. Now we have the Punisher, and oh, this was so good. This was great. Based slightly off of the Thomas Jane film, but also heavily off of the Garth Ennis comic books. This had a kind of a Grand Theft Auto sort of feel to it, but of course, no cars, just a guy with a gun killing people horribly. So much fun. It was gruesome, it was gory, you had elaborate kills, and so many comic book homages. Brilliant. Incredible Hulk was a really well-reviewed Incredible Hulk game. Based off the comic books, this one was bright and vibrant and a lot of fun to play. As you could imagine, you ran around as the Hulk, fighting bosses, smashing things, and it was generally a very good time. Marvel Nemesis, Rise of the Imperfects. I know I say this a lot and I get in trouble for it because I'm speaking for other people, but who asked for this? This is a Marvel fighting game. Yes, that's what Marvel fans want. And half the roster is a bunch of unknown people we've never heard of. I think they were hoping to use this as a springboard for, new properties and new franchises, but all it did was just water down the Marvel characters who were there. The generically titled X-Men the movie was of course based on X-Men The Last Stand, or X3, and the game was very run-of-the-mill. Not great, not terrible. It was released on so many different platforms, so there were different iterations of it, but all of them were kind of your typical kind of 5 or 6 out of 10. It does the job, but it's nothing that anyone's going to remember until like 20 years later when some dude makes a video about them. Marvel Ultimate Alliance. We're going back to the top-down action role-playing, but this time, rather than just the X-Men canon, we have the entire Marvel universe, and oh my god, it is a love letter to anyone who's been reading comic books for a long time. The list of characters and cameos in this game are just crazy. Who's who of Marvel characters and history, an absolute joy to go through. Spider-Man Battle for New York on Nintendo DS was set in the Ultimate Universe, which is something I'm kind of glad that we've done away with now. I understand retelling origins and bringing them up to date, but continuing ongoing storylines, you're just kind of retreading old ground, but sometimes not as good. Ultimate Line tried so hard to be edgy. Anyway, I digress. This game was average with middling kind of scores and reviews, but you got to play as Green Goblin, which was an unusual sort of thing to add, but that's about it. Spider-Man 3 is of course the licensed tie-in to the movie of the same name, and like that movie, it was met with general disappointment. What was surprising about this was that it seemed to be a step down from Spider-Man 2 as opposed to an improvement. Apparently the graphics weren't as nice, the story was short, and it all just felt kind of rushed. And even though I'm only covering this as one game, there was huge variance throughout all the different platforms it was on.
I should try to track down whatever those thugs were.
And sticking with video game movie tie-ins, we have Fantastic Four: Rise of the Silver Surfer. And unfortunately, like the film, this was not met with great response. One critic saying that it was dull, repetitive, and lazy, which is a real shame because the Fantastic Four with their powers and looks would really lend themselves to a great video game, but we have yet to see it. Maybe one day. And we're not slowing down with the movie tie-ins, as we also now have Ghost Rider. This was a game that met with, unsurprisingly, just kind of average to poor reviews. Another typical movie tie-in. It did have a nice mix though of God of War style chain combat and some fun riding racing type levels, but on the whole it didn't add up to a very spectacular overall package. Spider-Man Friend or Foe was a really bizarre little oddity where it was kind of set in the movie universe but with comic characters as well. It was a real strange sort of mashup, and the idea was that you would recruit these different villains to your side and be able to play with them and alongside them. So it was a really unique way of approaching a Spider-Man game, although ultimately the gameplay was nothing particularly special and it didn't really get amazing reviews. Man, the movie games keep coming and they don't stop coming. This time it's Iron Man. This is the launch of the MCU, but still, it's only a pale comparison as to what it was going to become. And the Iron Man game was one that was just kind of generically put out like all other movie games were at the time. So it was competent, but nothing particularly special. And rounding out our movie tie-ins, we have Incredible Hulk. And this was quite a step down from Ultimate Destruction, as a lot of critics said. It was like so many other movie tie-ins, it was kind of rushed out just to meet the similar kind of release date to capitalize on the hype. But ultimately, outside of some relatively fun smashing and brawling, there really was nothing else to this game, and it couldn't live up to its much better predecessor. Alright, we get to pick things up a bit now with Spider-Man Web of Shadows. This was a generally well-received game with a original, unique comic book story set in the 616, or whatever the gaming equivalent might be, because I guess if it's in a game, then it's not the 616, but I digress. Either way, symbiotes have invaded New York, and you can play as Spider-Man, choosing to either be bad with the symbiote or heroic without it. It's a fun game. Wolverine Origins is a unique example of a bad film making a pretty well-received game. This is a hack and slash type brawler that's based off of the Wolverine Origins movie, but then kind of taken in its own direction as well. And it is violent and brutal and not what we've seen from Wolverine on the silver screen. But now in a video game, it's a fun bit of mutant mayhem. Punisher No Mercy is what's called an arena-based shooter. So it's kind of a first-person game, but it doesn't have the long, driving narrative of many first-person games. It's more of a combative sort of multiplayer kind of experience. And it got below-average reviews. It was quite short and not overly polished, although people did say that at least it was a budget title, so you kind of get what you pay for. Marvel Superhero Squad, as you can see from the style of the cartoony animation, was aimed at a much younger audience, and it's actually a good-looking introduction to get young kids into Marvel Comics, which of course is what we need to do. That's how you know you bring them up right, when you introduce them to Spider-Man and the Hulk at an early age. It didn't get great reviews as a game, but for some kids' entertainment, it's probably not too bad. Marvel Ultimate Alliance 2. This is a game where sometimes more is more and sometimes more is less. This is, again, another love letter to superhero comic book Marvel readers. Everyone is in this game. It's like a Rolodex of Marvel characters, which is great, but then that does lead to a kind of an incoherent story, and apparently it is quite button mashy. So it's a wonderful love letter to the comics, but also maybe a little bit too much of stuff. Spider-Man Toxic City. Oh boy, we're in the era of mobile games. And look, we might even be missing a few because I have no idea how many mobile games are out there. We're just going off a wiki here, cards on the table. But this is a game that looks kind of pretty. I mean, for a mobile game, you've got to kind of scale these things accordingly. Is it any good? Honestly, I haven't the faintest idea. Iron Man 2, we're back to the movie tie-ins, and you can already tell me what I'm gonna say about it. It's got middling to negative reviews. All of these games, you get that feeling that they're only being made to coincide with the movie. That's hardly a shocker. But because of that, no one's trying to try anything new or dynamic or different. It's just pump out a game to meet the release date and capitalize on the demand at the time. And that's what this does to very average reviews. But now it's time for business to well and truly pick up with Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions. This game was a big turnaround for superhero games. You got to play as Spider-Man, Spider-Man 2099, Ultimate Spider-Man, and Spider-Man Noir, with each character having their own levels and very, very different styles and looks and types of gameplay. This game was a big hit and set the benchmark much higher for Spidey games. Marvel's Superhero Squad Infinity Gauntlet is very similar to the previous kids-centric Marvel-type game. This isn't designed to be some groundbreaking hardcore gaming experience. It's fun, light, fluffy, and cartoony, and designed to get younger kids into Marvel Comics characters and video games, and for that, I'm pretty sure it would have succeeded. Following Infinity Gauntlet, we had Grandmaster's Challenge. This was essentially more of the same, but following a different storyline, and because it was the 2010s and we were all still suffering from the Avatar hangover, it utilized some 3D elements as well. Again, it looks like a fun, goofy, silly, cartoony kids Marvel game, and you can't expect any more than that. Now this is an interesting one. We have Marvel Pinball. Now I've never really been a computer pinball player. I couldn't see the appeal, but that does not mean that this is not a good game that is very well crafted and there's a lot of enjoyment to be had because folks really like this game and it got some great reviews. Ultimate Spider-Man Total Mayhem is another iOS/Android mobile game. But from what the critics have said, this thing is actually pretty decent. You can't underestimate these mobile games. That's something that I'm learning from looking at these scores. Averaging around 85% on Metacritic, clearly what this game chose to do, it did very well and showed what could be done with this kind of mobile phone gaming. It was a long time in coming, but finally Marvel vs. Capcom 3 exploded back onto the scene. And this is your typical Marvel vs. Capcom type game, but gone are the animated looking 2D graphics, and you've got a 2D plane, but with this new advanced kind of 3D, 2D kind of look, which is a very big stylistic change. But the game generally received positive reviews from fighting fans. Marvel Superhero Squad Online. Well, you know what this is going to be about. It's another Marvel Superhero Squad game, so it's the small, cartoony, kid-friendly kind of versions of the Marvel superheroes, and this time you get to go online and play in some massively multiplayer online type scenarios, I would imagine. It's light, fun, fluffy, cartoony stuff, and I imagine probably good for its audience. Thor, God of Thunder. Of course, this is a tie-in to the first Thor movie. Gosh, that makes us all feel old. This game is not surprisingly kind of a very average to slightly below average experience according to most fans and critics. It's a tie-in to the movie to capitalize on all the hoopla and hype around at the time, and it's a typical God of War style action brawler, but apparently it doesn't bring much new to the table. Going back to iOS games, we have Thor's Son of Asgard, and much like the previous game, it's another movie tie-in that did not get particularly favorable reports and reviews. What critics did say was that it looked pretty good, the graphics and animation was of a decent standard, but the actual gameplay was somewhat lacking, there wasn't much to it, and it was a bit of a throwaway experience. Captain America Super Soldier, tying in, of course, to the Captain America movie, and it's what you would expect from this point. An inoffensive game that just doesn't really do anything particularly clever. Not a bad game according to some critics. It's just nothing that's anyone's going to remember, and especially when this is at the time of games like God of War and Bayonetta coming out and really showing what an action brawler could be, this game just didn't really make any waves. And sticking with the MCU games, we have Captain America, Sentinel of Liberty. Second verse, same as the first. You guys know this. It's a movie tie and it's kind of average. It didn't get very good scores, blah, blah, blah. I know, I'm just kind of repeating myself now. You know the score.
Compliments of Uncle Sam.
Spider-Man Edge of Time, the sequel to Shattered Dimensions, and unfortunately this suffers from that sequel problem of not being an improvement on the original but instead being a bit of a retread, and that's what fans and critics tended to think. Instead of the 4 different Spider-Man scenarios, you only had 2, with regular 616 and Spider-Man 2099, and ultimately it felt like a bit of a backward step for this series. X-Men Destiny made some unusual choices, the main one being that you don't play as any of the core X-Men. You play as new recruits to the Xavier Academy who have to choose whether or not to stick with the X-Men or side with the Brotherhood. And it got bad reviews with sloppy gameplay, poor combat, and generally negative opinions all round. Marvel's superhero comic combat was kind of a fun way of incorporating the comic books with the video games, and especially for a younger audience, this was a good way of sparking interest in the books that created these characters. Was it a great gaming experience? Honestly, I don't know. I couldn't find that many review scores for it. But as a concept of combining the two mediums into one, I think it was a noble effort regardless. Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 is of course just an update to Marvel vs. Capcom 3 Fate of Two Worlds. This is a Capcom 2D fighter, so of course that's going to be the case. Don't buy your Capcom fighters on release date, wait a year and then get the complete edition. And this game featured more characters, more backgrounds, lots of little tweaks and fixes for fighting fans to improve some balances. So it was an improvement, but come on Capcom, we're wise to you now. Marvel Ultimate Alliance was a clever way of trying to take advantage of social media at the time and was available on things like Facebook and MS and all sorts of stuff. I'm not going to pretend like I know that much about it. Either way, it seems like it was an attempt to integrate new technologies and platforms with gaming. It's a bit of a funny one that I seem to have found has fallen through the cracks a bit. There are probably others who know more about it than I do, but still, it existed. Amazing Spider-Man. We're out of the Tobey Maguire era and into the Andrew Garfield era, for better or for worse. And this game is very average. It's not terrible, but all reviews basically say it's just kind of there. It's fun to play, but there's not much to it. It's a little bit too easy. The controls aren't great. The graphics aren't amazing. It just kind of exists in its space, and it's not doing anything new with Spider-Man that hasn't already been done. Marvel vs. Capcom Origins is a combination re-release of Marvel Superheroes and Marvel vs. Capcom. These games weren't adjusted or anything, so they have the same kind of balancing issues and all the problems that they had when they were originally in the arcade. So they have aged a bit, and they do kind of show their age, but at the same time, it's a great little time capsule and a way for a new generation of players to see how these fighting games originally started. Marvel War of Heroes is an iOS Android type game. We're getting a lot more of these now, but it seems that they were pretty popular, and there must be a reason for that. Probably those predatory mechanics, but hey, we can't help getting addicted. And this is a card-based battler type game, kind of like a digital version of Magic the Gathering, from what I assume. And hey, it was another thing that existed. Marvel Avengers Battle for Earth is an interesting one as it's based on the Secret Invasion comic book storyline. So it's quite nice to see the comic book stories getting translated into games as opposed to just the movies. It didn't make a huge splash, but it wasn't a terrible game either, according to critics. It was just kind of there. So while you still had the real big money brawlers like God of War and such, this one just kind of existed without making too big waves. Avengers Initiative was another iOS Android type game, and this one was a one-on-one brawler from what I can see with touchscreen controls. So it's not like the fast twitch Street Fighter style gameplay, but more kind of precision, deciding what move you're going to do, and I would imagine it was fun. Couldn't tell you either way, but see for yourself. Iron Man 3, the game, is kind of what you would expect by this point. Come on, we've gone through a lot of movie games by now. So it got very kind of average reviews, very sort of 5 out of 10, 50%. Not good, not great, but just there. One thing that was kind of fun was that a lot of it takes place after Iron Man 3. So even though it's not canon, you can fill in some extra points if you would like. It's even got MODOK and more stuff with AIM, so that's kind of fun. Marvel Heroes, the first massively multiplayer online role-playing game, or MMORPG. There's something very satisfying about saying that. I don't know much about this because I wasn't an MMORPG type person, but it was free to play, so they want to kind of get you in there and get you hooked. But it looks like this is the time where other games, I want to say EverQuest, but that's probably showing my age. World of Warcraft, there you go. That was probably dominating at the time, so maybe Marvel was tough to try and get a look in. It's time for Deadpool to get his own game. Before he really came into his own with his own movies, this was a great showcase for the character. It's very Bayonetta, chainsaw lollipop, crazy, goofy, hack and slash brawler. It doesn't do anything to reinvent the wheel, but it's a fun time. And this is so comic book oriented. We didn't have a movie Deadpool to go off, so we get great comic book style stories and cameos and characters. It's not amazing, but it's fun. Marvel Puzzle Quest. For someone who grew up with Tetris on the Game Boy and columns on the Sega Game Gear, I can see the appeal of this. And apparently, according to reviews, this was really highly regarded. There's a real level, apparently, of skill and planning and technique and strategy that goes into playing this game. So I can just imagine how many hours I would have poured into this had I got into it. Probably for the best that I didn't. Lego Marvel Superheroes. What a match made in heaven. You've got the bright, colorful Marvel characters with the goofy, ridiculous humor of Lego. And this is just a joyous kind of experience. How could it possibly take itself too seriously? It doesn't. It's tongue-in-cheek, it's lighthearted. You get to play with so many different characters. And it's just a collect-a-thon, run around, a few puzzles, a bit of fighting. It's just a generally good time. Thor: The Dark World, another iOS Android game and a tie-in to Thor: The Dark World, the movie, which is still to this day one of the lowest regarded Marvel movies just in general. But me personally, I got a little place in my heart for Thor: The Dark World. This game didn't make particular waves, it does what it says on the tin. It's a basic Thor iOS game, so I don't think anyone hated it, but no one was singing its praises either. Sticking with the iOS games, we have X-Men Battle of the Atom. And as you can see, this is your typical kind of touchscreen, turn-based strategy sort of games, which I imagine iOS games are probably very well suited for with phone screens and whatnot. I don't know how well it did, and I don't know how much fun it was to play, but it existed, and here's some footage of it. And rounding out the trifecta of Android games, we have Captain America. And this is another run-around brawler type of game. Nothing clever, nothing crazy. Can you tell I'm running out of stuff to say about these games? Lucky we're well into the late 20-teens now.
Captain America, just in time.
Amazing Spider-Man 2, the game, like the film, unfortunately did not meet with much critical praise or even mild happiness. It's following the same Spider-Man movie game formula, but this seems so tired by this point, and that's what critics generally said, was that there's just not much fun to be had with this. It's nothing exciting or new or different, the graphics are kind of blare, and it's just kind of a swan song in a bad way for this type of Spider-Man movie game. Kellogg's Amazing Spider-Man 2 for Android and iOS. What was the Amazing Spider-Man 2 missing? A breakfast cereal cornflakes tie-in. Obviously! But you can see from this game, it's a little bit curious that it's actually got some first-person action going on here. I don't know if that's the whole game or just a section of it. I couldn't find any more footage. But it's an interesting take at least. Was it good? Who knows? But I like cornflakes, and that's an opinion I can stand by. Uncanny X-Men Days of Future Past. I can't believe I'm saying it again. This is a 2D side-scrolling hack and slash beat 'em up with platforming elements. I haven't said that for years now. In this video, doing this filming, I said it about half an hour ago. But still, it's kind of fun to go back to a side-scrolling X-Men game. It's just like old times. Was it any good? I haven't the foggiest idea. But here you can see Wolverine jumping around and he seems to enjoy himself. Oh my goodness, Spider-Man Unlimited. This is one I can attest to. It's a free runner, which is a genre that popped up around this time, and it is addictive. You just swipe left and right to make Spider-Man dodge out of the way of different obstacles. There's little web swinging bits which are so simple but feel really satisfying, and the amount of costumes are crazy. So many comic book deep cuts. This is a dangerously addictive game. Disney Infinity, Toys for Life. I can think of exactly one thing wrong with that title. This did not last. I'm not entirely sure what the concept was because probably I'm old and out of touch, but something about you buy a toy and you can plug it into a thing and then it translates to a video game that you can play, and then of course the idea was you would want to add more stuff and buy more figures that then enhance the game. It was a clever concept, but it would seem it never really took off. Guardians of the Galaxy Universal Weapon for iOS and Android. It seems like this is another one of those turn-based Final Fantasy strategy fighting type games. I can't say if it was very successful. I can't find much information about these Android games. I knew this list would fall apart at the end, but hey, its bright and colourful chibi art style looks kind of fun. It's a break from the norm from what we expect of these games, and hey, I'm sure those who enjoy it got to fill their boots. Marvel Disc Wars Avengers Ultimate Heroes on 3DS. Whew, that's a mouthful. As you can see, you play as some of the Avengers and you battle foes and forces of evil. I don't know what else to tell you. Just judging from here, it looks like a fairly competent game, but since I can find very little on it, I'm guessing to say that it wasn't a hugely impactful title, but hey, it's not famous for being awful, so I guess it was just there. Marvel Contest of Champions. Well, this one is definitely a game that has withstood the test of time, still going strong with various iterations and updates to this day, and even brought in new characters that are now sort of becoming canonical in different media. So as you can see, it's a typical kind of fighter, but it seems like it has a really deep kind of player base and nuances to it that people have really cottoned onto, and this game is actually kind of a success story. Marvel Future Fight, another iOS Android game. This seems to be the predominant genre in the late 20-teens. That's how folks are playing their games these days. Now, I don't know very much about this. Wow, what an informative video you've made, Dave. But you can see it looks kind of bright and colorful. We're in this era now where graphics generally are pretty decent. The mechanics, who knows? But it did seem to have a strong following as player currency usage and whatnot were apparently very high. Lego Marvel Avengers. What do I need to say about this game? You all know the basis and the idea of the Lego games. You run around, you build stuff, you collect things. It's light, fluffy, and just a good time. And of course, with the Marvel characters, with the Avengers, you've got a great toy box of figures to go through and experience these different superpowers and scenarios. It looks like a really fun time and conversely was very popular. Marvel Avengers Academy. Ooh, this is where we're getting dangerously close to predatory freemium games, and this is kind of a bad example of that, where of course you suck players in with a free-to-play game and then you start trying to rinse them for all of their money. So a dark period of our gaming history, and one that still exists in quite a few forms actually, but it's being frowned upon more and more. Rightly so. Kellogg's Marvel Civil War, another interesting serial mashup, this time translating the events of the Civil War movie into a game and a first-person type view that the name at least implies a VR tag as well. I'm not sure how that fits in with the mobile phone iOS gaming, but still, it seems like a curious sort of oddity. You can see in the footage you're fighting crossbones there, so a unique experience. Was it any good? I couldn't honestly say. Marvel Avengers Alliance 2. It's what you would expect, another one of the turn-based strategy fighting games, very Final Fantasy-ish, as I said before. You look at your players' stats and their abilities, how many hit points things take off, all those kinds of statistical type things that I struggle to follow. Psh, nerds. But again, it's bright and colorful, and it definitely catered to a market that was there and wanted more of this. Marvel Tsum Tsum. Look at these adorable little buggers. I remember seeing the plushies of these in the crane machines in Japan and being like, what mad scientist thought of Marvel and cute things and just mashed them together into this little merchandising bundle? But here we are, and it was pretty popular. It is, as they would say, mecha kawaii, and I guess the game was pretty popular off the back of that. Marvel Heroes Omega was an update to the massively multiplayer online role-playing game MMORPG that I mentioned earlier. Gosh, that's kind of a satisfying tongue-twisting mouthful. Apparently, it fixed some of the grievances that people had with the previous game and made a few little tweaks here and there, but by this point it would seem the bloom was kind of off the rose for this game and the MMORPG sort of genre for Marvel, at least in this iteration, and eventually the servers were closed not long after.
Your actions are futile. You cannot kill me.
Telltale Games Guardians of the Galaxy. Crazy that we've gone so long so far and we still get a new genre. Telltale is famous for their, not point and click, but I'd say narrative story-based games where it's almost like a choose-your-own adventure book. They had massive success with The Walking Dead, and of course they did ones like Back to the Future, Game of Thrones, and Guardians of Galaxy got their own go-round with this studio. Speaking of new genres, we are really in the future now with Spider-Man Homecoming, the VR experience. Yep, you can strap on your Oculus Rift or PlayStation VR or whatever one you want to choose, and you can experience what it's like to be Spider-Man in a static location shooting off web bullets. You got to start somewhere, haven't you? But this looked kind of fun, but I haven't tried VR myself. I'm not sure how it would work with me, but it would be interesting. Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite. Wow, I recommend you go and check out Matt McMuscle's channel. He has a series of videos called What Happened? Where he looks at the epic game sort of failures or disasters or crazy behind the scenes stories, and this is one of them. This game was enjoyable to play for fighting fans, but it had a lot of bad things going for it, with a very ugly initial art style and also no mutants because Marvel was being funny at the time. Lego Marvel Superheroes 2 is exactly what we've come to expect from the Lego franchises, and that is no bad thing. This one in particular probably having its biggest selling point being the wonderfully obscure characters that it includes. By this point, Lego had absolutely run the gamut of all these different Marvel heroes, so they thought, you know what, let's try and get as creative as possible. And that combined with the Lego style of comedy and storytelling, it was a really well-received game. Marvel Strike Force, another big gun in the iOS Android Marvel gaming library. This one a tactical fighter, team-based strategy type game. If you watch any videos on YouTube, then you've probably seen the commercial for this running before you actually get to what you want to see. Hopefully one of my vids. But it seems to be a very popular game, huge player base, and it does what it does very well. Marvel End Time Arena on just PC Windows. So this was a very exclusive game and probably didn't get a lot of coverage because of that. Of course, that's me speaking very subjectively saying, well, I didn't hear about it. Obviously, it didn't get much coverage. Couldn't be that I just wasn't having my finger on the pulse at the time. But it looks like another Diablo-style team-based running around RPG type game and might have been a lot of fun. Marvel Powers United, another VR Oculus Rift type game. These things don't seem to have quite found their niche yet. I feel like we're waiting for the technology to catch up with the ideas we have. I haven't tried Oculus Rift. I'm really excited to see what that kind of experience is like. I think Marvel would certainly lend itself to this kind of four-dimensional or three-dimensional experience. I get my dimensions confused. Either way, it might be a good time.
Will break upon Mjolnir.
Sorry to break it.
Here we are, finally! It's Sony's Spider-Man, my favorite Marvel game. Taking nostalgia out of the equation, this thing was just incredible. And oh boy, there was so much hype leading up to it. This thing was announced years before it came out, and we were all saying, please, please be good, please be good. And oh my giddy lord, it delivered in a big way. Amazing mechanics, web slinging, fighting, beautiful graphics. This game was the ultimate Spider-Man experience. Marvel Battle Lines on iOS and Android. What does this game do? I'm not entirely sure myself. Can you judge? It looks kind of puzzly, kind of like columnsy, but not exactly. I got nothing. What can I say? It looks kind of pretty, but that's about it. I think it's probably a good thing with my addictive kind of personality that I steer clear from these iOS games, so you have to figure it out for yourself. The home consoles get the VR experience with Spider-Man Far From Home VR. This already looks like a step up from the original Spider-Man Homecoming VR, and now you're moving and swinging. There are huge big robots and mechs, so clearly they've taken some fun inspiration from the source material and thrown it out there to see what they can do in VR. Is it a good experience? I have no idea, but I'd be excited to find out. Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3, The Black Order. After a huge long hiatus, we go back to the Ultimate Alliance genre or franchise, I suppose, and now it's on Nintendo Switch, a console that I think really lends itself to this type of game. Great to be able to pick up and play for a bit, then put back down, and it got a good reception. It had flaws. I haven't played it yet, but I would kind of like to, because this might be the best way to deliver this experience to me. Avengers Damage Control is an Iron Man themed VR game, but this was a tough one to find stuff on. All I could find on YouTube are a few kind of teaser type trailers that don't reveal too much about it, and unfortunately some slightly negative reviews from people who have played the game, and they say that it's an interesting VR experience, but it's not really anything to write home about, and just it's a thing, basically. It's a thing. Marvel Super War is another iOS MOBA game, which I realized from doing all of these reviews that MOBA is that kind of team battle sort of genre that I've been referring to so much as Final Fantasy style playing. And it's just another in a long, long line of Marvel iOS fighting games, so clearly there's a big appetite for these. Marvel Duel appears to be a card-based strategy fighting game in the same sort of style as your classic Magic the Gathering sort of genre. Can you tell I'm sort of riffing here because I don't really know too much about it? This video is sort of like free-form jazz. I don't even know where it's going. I just keep making noise until the video stops. Marvel's Iron Man VR on the PS4 was another outing into the VR sort of genre and experience. It seems like we're probably going to spend years with people tweaking the VR technology and hopefully trying to make it better and more compatible for everyday living. I don't want VR to go the way of 3D TVs, where people thought this was a good idea, spent a lot of money, invested in glasses, and then realized, this isn't something we really want. Hopefully VR can turn it around. Marvel's Avengers. Oh, what a disappointment this game was. So much hype going into it, especially after the massive success of Sony's Spider-Man. Marvel were looking for another big win in the video game market, but this thing was a little bit snakebit from the start, with people pointing out how ugly the character designs were, with really bland, generic sort of looking faces and a drab kind of color palette, and ultimately the game was a bit of a disappointment. We're finishing on a high note though, folks. It is Miles Morales Spider-Man on the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5. A wonderful follow-up to Sony's Spider-Man from 2018, I want to say. This game is more of the same. It's not a full-blown bells and whistles sequel. It's like extended DLC, but it's a great package. You get your money's worth, even though it is a smaller game, and just whet your appetite for a full-on Spider-Man sequel. Whew. And guys, that is it. That is every single Marvel game ever made, ever in the history of all time, without a single one forgotten. Right? I'm sure you'll let me know either way. But I hope you enjoyed this. This was a real labor of love, but I had a lot of fun putting it together. So much amazing nostalgia just coming at me from Mega Drive games and Maximum Carnage and times in the arcades. What an incredible history we have of Marvel games. Folks, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, then please like, comment, share, subscribe. Check out the other videos on my channel, which are predominantly all about action figures, Marvel Legends, all that kind of stuff is what I'm all about. And if you want to show some extra support to the channel, you can go over to patreon.com/displaying model behavior, throw a few Marvel bucks my way. But guys, thank you so much for watching. It's been an absolute pleasure making this video. I hope you enjoy it. And until next time, keep displaying model behavior.
Chill. Yeah.